It was the kind of rain that didn't just fall. It pressed against the glass as if trying to get in. The kind of rain that makes the city blur into streaks of white and orange, neon signs bleeding down the pane in crooked lines. I stood in the lobby of Veltrix Optics, clutching a still warm paper cup of coffee I'd barely tasted. The security guard gave me the usual nod, but there was something in his eyes, a quick glance at the visitor log that made my stomach tighten. My badge still worked when I swiped it. For now. The elevator ride up to the 27th floor was quiet, except for the low hum of the machinery. I'd been in this building for 12 years, and yet the steel panels felt cold under my fingertips that morning. As I rose past each floor, my reflection in the brushed metal wavered, suit slightly rumpled, tie knotted tight, the first silver hairs showing above my ears. I told myself I was imagining the summons, that this was just another quarterly check-in. But somewhere deep down, I knew. The glass-walled conference room waited at the end of the corridor like a lit aquarium. Inside sat Helen Fraser, COO of Veltrix, poised in her charcoal suit, legs crossed at an angle that looked both comfortable and calculated. Beside her, the new HR director, a man whose name I couldn't remember, flipped through a folder with deliberate slowness. "Marcus, come in," Helen said, smiling without warmth. The room smelled faintly of her perfume, jasmine layered over something leathery and expensive. I'd once found it pleasant. Today it was almost nauseating. "Please, have a seat," HR said, gesturing to a chair opposite them. I sat, though my legs wanted to carry me somewhere, anywhere, else. Helen leaned forward, fingers laced. "We'll get straight to it. As part of a restructuring initiative, your role as Chief of Cybersecurity is being dissolved." That word, dissolved, felt obscene, like I was sugar in hot water, gone, without residue. The HR man began reading from a prepared statement, his tone so flat it could have been automated. "Your termination is effective immediately. You will receive 3 months severance in accordance with—" I didn't hear the rest. My gaze fixed on the view behind them, the rain-streaked skyline, cranes frozen mid-air on unfinished towers. The world outside didn't care that the ground was shifting under my feet. I forced myself back into the moment just in time for the real blow. "Your position will be filled by Nathan Clark," Helen said, as if announcing the winner of some petty office raffle. "You've met him. From the innovation team." Nathan. The kid who'd once shrugged off encryption protocols as overcomplication. I almost laughed. They're handing my keys to someone who doesn't believe in locks. I felt my pulse in my temples. For a second I thought I might actually black out. But instead, I picked up the pen they slid across the table, signing where they told me to. My hand didn't feel like my own. Helen's voice softened just enough to sound rehearsed. "We're grateful for your contributions, Marcus. Truly." 12 years, I wanted to say. 12 years of building the digital fortress they're standing in. 12 years of sleeping in the server room during the ransomware siege, of missing birthdays, of carrying their secrets in encrypted vaults no one else could touch. I left with a cardboard box containing the stripped-down version of my life, a photo of me and my ex-wife back when we still smiled at each other, a coffee mug from the year we beat the breach that could have ended us, the silver watch my father gave me when I got the promotion to chief. The elevator doors closed on Helen's faint smile, and I wondered if she knew how it looked, like she was watching a chapter end with satisfaction. In the lobby, the security guard avoided my eyes as he signed me out. Outside, the rain felt colder than it had looked from 27 floors up. I stood for a moment under the awning, cardboard box soaking at the corners, coffee cooling in my hand. It wasn't until I reached my car that I remembered something. An old piece of code I'd buried deep in Veltrix's architecture years ago. A failsafe. It was never meant for this. Not exactly. designed for emergencies. It could lock the system down tighter than a vault in seconds. Betrayal was an emergency, wasn't it? As I drove away, the wipers kept time with my thoughts, each sweep clearing the glass only for it to blur again. 12 years had just been reduced to ink on paper and a box of leftovers. But under the humiliation, under the loss, something else began to take shape. Something cold, deliberate, and patient. I didn't know then whether I'd use it. But I knew this much. If I did, they'd never see it coming. The night after my firing, I couldn't sleep. The rain had stopped, but the city still hummed outside my window. Traffic murmurs, a siren in the distance, the faint clink of bottles being sorted in the alley. I sat at my kitchen table with the Veltrix watch my father had given me resting in front of me, its face ticking steadily, as if mocking how much time I had traded away. 12 years. When I first walked into Veltrix, I was 29 and certain I was on the edge of something important. The company was still young then, just 2 floors of rented office space above a half-empty shopping plaza. The air smelled of fresh paint and optimism. The data center was so new, you could still feel the static cling from the shrink wrap that had been peeled off the server racks. I remember shaking hands with Daniel Meyer, my first boss and one of the founders. His grip was firm, his smile honest. "Welcome aboard," he'd said. "Just remember, loyalty here is conditional. They'll act like family, but we're all replaceable." I laughed then, thinking he was, exaggerating. The early days were brutal but exhilarating. I slept under my desk more than once, a jacket balled up for a pillow, the hum of the cooling fans lulling me into dreamless naps. We fought off phishing campaigns, DDoS floods, and one terrifying zero-day exploit that could have leaked our entire client list. It was during that crisis that Helen first took notice of me. She wasn't COO yet, just a sharp, ambitious operations manager with a talent for navigating board politics. After we patched the breach, she came to my cubicle with a smile and a paper cup of coffee. "You're the invisible wall," she said. "Nobody knows you're there until you save them." I took that as a compliment. Years blurred together after that. Promotions came, paychecks grew, but so did the hours. My marriage didn't survive the transition. My ex used to complain that she never saw me without a laptop glow on my face. By the time she left, I'd stopped trying to explain that some walls can't be left unmanned. There were red flags, plenty of them. Budget cuts that always seemed to hit my department first. Helen's quiet push to streamline security protocols so clients wouldn't find them too cumbersome. The way my requests for additional staff were met with polite smiles and no action. But I told myself politics was someone else's game. I was a builder, a protector. If I just did my job better than anyone else, I'd be safe. One night in particular comes back to me. It was winter, the kind where your breath hangs in the air even indoors because the heating can't keep up. I was in the server room alone, watching the green lights pulse in perfect sync. The Veltrix watch on my wrist caught the glow, its glass face reflecting 1,000 tiny points of light. I remember feeling proud, not of myself exactly, but of the fortress I'd built. Every line of code, every encrypted tunnel, every INS. Intrusion detection rule. My fingerprints were on it all. Helen stopped by that night too, coat draped over her arm, smelling of that same jasmine and leather perfume. She leaned in the doorway watching me work. "Marcus," she said softly, "you're the kind of person companies are built on." I carried that sentence with me for years. But as her influence grew, so did her distance. She became COO, moved into the corner office, and our conversations shifted from collaborative problem-solving to brief transactional check-ins. She'd still smile, but it was the kind of smile that came after rehearsing it in the mirror. I ignored the warnings from others. Luis, my old college friend who'd done a stint in our dev team, once told me over lunch, "Man, Helen plays a long game. Just be careful." I waved him off. She's never given me a reason not to trust her. Looking back, I realized trust had become my blind spot. I'd equated my worth with my usefulness. Every late night, every crisis handled, every time I skipped a vacation, I thought it was buying me permanence. One spring, we faced a ransomware attack that could have sunk us. For 72 hours, I barely left the building. My beard came in patchy and uneven. My suit smelled faintly of coffee and sweat. But we won. We beat it back, restored every byte, and avoided a single public headline. Helen had hugged me in front of the board. "You're irreplaceable," she'd said. I think I actually believed her. 12 years of trust. 12 years of pouring myself into a fortress I thought was mine to guard. Sitting in my kitchen that night, I stared at the watch again. Its ticking was steady, but I knew better now. The hands were just moving in circles, never actually getting anywhere. I thought about Daniel's warning on my first day, about Luis's caution, about every green light I'd ever celebrated in that server room. And I thought about Helen's smile as the elevator doors closed yesterday, the faintest trace of satisfaction in it. The trust I'd built wasn't just in Veltrix. It was in the illusion that merit was enough to keep me safe. That loyalty was a kind of currency that could be banked for bad times. But I knew something now, something I wished I'd understood from the start. In the corporate world, loyalty isn't a savings account. It's a vending machine. You feed it until it stops working, and then they roll it away for a newer model. The watch ticked on, each second a reminder of time spent, time lost, and time, maybe, still to come. Somewhere in the labyrinth of Veltrix's systems, my fail-safe waited. I hadn't built it for revenge, but maybe it was like trust, adaptable, conditional. That night, I slid the watch back onto my wrist. I didn't know if it was a shackle or a weapon yet. Maybe both. 3 days. That's how long it took for Veltrix's ghost to come knocking. I'd spent those days in my apartment with the blinds drawn, moving between the couch and the kitchen like a shadow of myself. Coffee mugs and empty takeout cartons lined the counter. The watch on my wrist ticked on, stubbornly marking time even as mine seemed to have stopped. I hadn't touched my laptop since leaving the building, but the fail-safe, my fail-safe, didn't need me to babysit it. It was buried deep in their infrastructure, disguised as routine system maintenance. All it needed was for the clock to hit the right moment. On the third morning, I woke to my phone buzzing on the nightstand. I ignored it, assuming it was another recruiter pretending they had my dream job. Then it buzzed again, and again. I finally grabbed it, my eyes gritty from too little sleep. It wasn't a recruiter. It was a news alert. Breaking. Veltrix Optics suffers major network outage. I sat up slowly. The article loaded in pieces, my spotty apartment Wi-Fi dragging it out like a suspense scene in a bad movie. Unprecedented system failure. All terminals unresponsive. Client operation has halted. No comment from Veltrix leadership. I could see it in my mind. The server room I'd once called mine, now as dark as a tomb. Every green light I'd ever celebrated replaced by silence. On the TV, a local business channel was already covering it. The split screen showed a stock photo of Veltrix's headquarters on the left, and, on the right, a frazzled anchor reading from her notes. They cut to live footage, employees standing in clusters outside the building, their badges useless against locked doors. Somewhere inside, engineers would be tearing through my codebase, looking for a way in. They wouldn't find it, not without the key. My key. It should have felt triumphant. In a way it did. But the satisfaction was tangled with something else. Grief. Because that network had been my work, my late nights, my fingerprints on every protocol. I remembered the first time I'd powered it all up, the hum of the servers settling into a perfect, reassuring rhythm. Watching it run had felt like watching a city wake up at dawn. Lights flicking on, roads filling with movement. Now it was a city under siege, and I was both its architect and its captor. The watch on my wrist ticked steadily as I muted the TV. I could almost hear the panic unfolding 27 floors above the lobby. Board members pacing, voices rising. Helen, somewhere in the middle of it, still smelling of that perfume, maybe not so composed now. By noon, the calls started. First, it was an unlisted number I didn't recognize. I let it ring out. Then came a text from Luis. "Are you seeing the news?" I didn't answer. The next call came from a number I did know, Veltrix's main line. I stared at it until it went to voicemail. 10 minutes later it rang again, but this time it wasn't Helen. It was Robert, a senior board member who'd always been polite to me, even if we'd never been close. "Marcus," he said, his voice tight, We need your help." I let the silence stretch. I wanted him to feel it. "I'm not sure if you've seen." "I've seen," I said. There was a pause. "We'd like to bring you in as a consultant, temporarily, just until things are stable." I could almost hear the tension in the air on his side, the room full of people listening in, willing me to agree. "My rate is triple what I was making before," I said, my tone steady. "Paid up front." Another pause, longer this time. A muffled voice in the background, maybe Helen's. Then Robert cleared his throat. "Done." It was a strange thing, agreeing to save the very people who'd discarded me. But this wasn't about loyalty anymore. This was about leverage. About reminding them that I had never been invisible. I'd been the wall, and they'd torn it down without thinking about what might get through. After we hung up, I sat for a long time in the quiet. I thought about the people still there, the ones who'd worked beside me, who had nothing to do with Helen's decision. This wasn't their fault. Still, I didn't regret it. The fail-safe wasn't just revenge. It was a lesson. That night, I stepped out onto my balcony for the first time since the rain. The air smelled cleaner, cooler. Somewhere down the block, someone was cooking garlic, and for the first time in days, I felt hungry. In the glow from my apartment, I caught sight of the Veltrix watch. The second hand swept across the face, marking the moment. Not the end, not the beginning, just the point where one became the other. The transfer hit my account on a Tuesday morning. I stared at the number for a long time, not in disbelief, but in a kind of detached curiosity. It was the same figure I'd once have thought of as impossible, back when my life was built around a paycheck that barely kept up with the hours I bled into Veltrix's walls. Now it was just leverage turned liquid. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I booked the cottage online, packed a single suitcase, and drove until the skyline shrank in the rear view, and the air took on that damp, salty smell of the coast. The road wound through pine forests, the trees leaning in like they were shielding me from something. When I arrived, the place felt almost too still. A small, cedar-shingled cottage sat at the edge of a bluff, its porch facing the grey sweep of the Atlantic. The wind smelled of brine and wood smoke from some unseen neighbour's chimney. Inside, the floors were scuffed pine, the furniture mismatched but clean. A single window in the living room framed the ocean like a painting that moved. I set my Veltrix watch on the windowsill without thinking. The afternoon sun caught its face, and for a second, the glass reflected back the sea. I told myself I'd only take it off while I was here, that it was too tied to the life I'd just left behind. But some part of me already knew it wouldn't go back on my wrist the same way. Each morning, I made coffee and sat at the small kitchen table with my laptop. I connected through a secure tunnel to Veltrix's crippled network and began the slow work of restoration. My hands moved automatically. I knew the architecture like I knew my own apartment. The hum of their servers was gone, but in my mind, I could still hear it, could still picture each rack, each cable run. This time, though, I didn't belong there. I was no longer a name on their payroll, no longer invited to Friday strategy, calls or quarterly dinners. I was a vendor, distant, transactional. The line had been drawn, and I found I liked standing on the far side of it. By early afternoon, I'd log off. Sometimes I'd walk down the narrow trail to the beach, my shoes crunching on the gravel path. The tide left streaks of foam along the sand, and the gulls' calls echoed in the wind. I started breathing differently here, slower, deeper, like I was learning a new rhythm. One morning, I found an old notebook in the desk drawer. Its pages were blank except for a single line in neat handwriting. Freedom is a kind of currency. I didn't know whose words they were, but they stuck with me. That night, I called Luis. He drove up 2 days later, bringing a bag of coffee beans and a six-pack from a local brewery. We sat on the porch as the sun went down, the ocean turning from slate grey to black. "You look better," he said, after a sip. "I feel lighter," I admitted. "Not fixed, but lighter." He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking. "Told you. Sometimes you have to get distance to see the game for what it is." We didn't talk about Helen much. We didn't have to. But he did ask, eventually, "So what's next? After you hand them back their shiny fortress?" I looked out at the horizon. The waves rolled in, steady and indifferent. Maybe I build something of my own, one where the walls are mine to keep. Over the weeks, I began sketching in that notebook. Not code, not yet, just ideas. A company that valued integrity over politics. Security systems built to protect people, not just profits. A team that could see the long game without eating its own. The Veltrix watch stayed on the windowsill. I started noticing the way the sun faded its strap, the way the once silver case began to dull. Each day its connection to me weakened, just as my attachment to Veltrix did. It became less a tool for telling time and more a quiet record of what time could take away. By the end of the first month, Veltrix's systems were humming again under my remote care. They didn't thank me, not in any meaningful way, but they paid every invoice within hours. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was necessary, and necessity came with a different kind of respect. Still, every night when I shut my laptop, the ocean was there. The salt on the air, the sound of the waves. These things had nothing to do with Veltrix, and everything to do with what I was becoming. And somewhere in the back of my mind, the thought had begun to take root. Maybe my failsafe had done more than lock them out. Maybe it had unlocked me. The morning I sent Veltrix the final restoration key, the wind off the Atlantic was fierce enough to rattle the window frames. The cottage smelled of salt and the faint, lingering bitterness of last night's coffee. I'd thought the moment would feel heavier, like I was handing them back the crown jewels. But instead, it was clean, almost surgical, a final line of code, a secure packet pushed into their system, and the fortress I'd once built for them was whole again. I didn't send it without a gift of my own, a subtle, silent layer of monitoring buried deep inside the architecture. Nothing malicious, nothing illegal, just a sentinel to whisper to me if they ever tried to tamper with my original frameworks, not for revenge, for curiosity, for closure. Within an hour, I had an email from their CFO confirming receipt and acknowledging my invaluable assistance. There was no warmth in the words, no attempt at personal thanks. Veltrix had always been like that. Handshake one day, knife the next. I closed the laptop and let the ocean wind have the room. That night, over beer and the sound of rain on the porch roof, I told Luis my decision. "I'm starting something new," I said. "Something that doesn't answer to people like Helen." He grinned, as if he'd been waiting for me to say it. "About time. What's the plan?" "Security firm. SM. All sharp team. No politics, no corporate theatre. Systems built the right way, with the right people. Transparent contracts, clear ethics. We decide who we work for, and who we don't. Luis raised his bottle. Ellison Secure, he said, as if naming it into being. The next morning, I wrote it at the top of the notebook page. Ellison Secure. The name looked both strange and right in my handwriting, as if it had been waiting for me. The loft came first, a converted textile mill in the city's warehouse district. Red brick, tall windows, beams that still smelled faintly of the oil that had soaked into them decades ago. The rent was steep for an unproven business, but the light was perfect, and I could see the space filled with whiteboards, workstations, and a hum of focused energy that didn't come from fear. The first hires were people like me, veterans who'd been burned by the corporate world and weren't eager to go back. Priya, who'd led infrastructure for a major bank until they cut her team to outsource for efficiency. Jonah, a penetration tester who'd walked away after his CEO ignored a breach report for 3 months. And of course, Luis. We worked at folding tables at first, laptops balanced on stacks of network manuals, the echo of our footsteps still too loud in the empty loft. But there was a quiet joy in it, in building something not out of obligation, but out of choice. Veltrix's payments became our seed capital. Every invoice they paid felt like another brick in the walls of my own fortress. And the irony wasn't lost on me. The same company that had discarded me was now bankrolling my independence. Our first contracts came faster than I expected, not from tech giants, but from companies that had their own scars. A law firm whose partners had been blindsided by a partner embezzlement scandal. A non-profit whose donor database had been leaked by an insider. They weren't just buying security, they were buying trust. One afternoon, while unpacking a shipment of server equipment, I caught Priya staring at the watch on the windowsill. "That from Veltrix?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "Hasn't left that spot since I got here." "It's faded," she observed. I glanced at it. She was right. The once sharp lettering on the strap had bleached to a pale ghost of itself. I thought about explaining the symbolism, the way it marked the distance between who I'd been and who I was becoming. But I just said, "Sun does that to things." By month 4, the loft had transformed. The folding tables were gone, replaced by custom workbenches and ergonomic chairs. The whiteboards were crowded with architecture diagrams, code snippets, and lists of potential clients. In one corner, a server rack hummed quietly, the low-frequency sound grounding the space in a way that reminded me, in a gentler way, of Veltrix's data center. I started sleeping better. Not just because the work was mine, but because I wasn't guarding someone else's castle at the expense of my own life. Whispers reached me through the industry grapevine. Helen was in trouble. The downtime incident had drawn the board's attention to her cost-efficiency initiatives, and several projects she'd championed had gone over budget. She was, as Luis put it, losing altitude. I didn't gloat, not out loud, but I carried the knowledge like a warm stone in my pocket. She'd played her game, and now the board was watching the same way she once watched me, calculating whether she was worth keeping. One Friday evening, as the last of the team packed up, I stood at the loft's tall windows and looked out over the city. The sun was sinking, casting the rooftops in gold. In my mind, I saw the glass-walled conference room on Veltrix's 27th floor, the reflection of rain-streaked neon, Helen's perfume curling in the air like smoke. I thought about how different the air felt here, open, unperfumed, carrying only the faint tang of solder from the workbench. The fortress I was building wasn't made of stone or steel or even code. It was made of choices. Each contract we took, each person we hired, each decision not to compromise, those were the walls. And unlike Veltrix, I wasn't building it for someone else to inherit. When I locked the door that night, the loft was quiet, except for the hum of the servers. A sound that, for the first time in years, didn't make me think of sleepless nights or looming disasters. It just sounded safe. The watch on the cottage windowsill would keep fading. Helen's influence would keep shrinking. And Ellison Secure would keep growing, brick by brick, line of code by line of code. I didn't know then that the final confrontation was closer than I imagined. But I knew one thing for certain. When it came, I wouldn't be walking into it as the man Veltrix had discarded. I'd be walking in as the man who built his own fortress. It started with an email. Not from Helen. She wouldn't dare. This one came from Veltrix's general counsel, a man whose name I'd only seen on contracts, never spoken aloud. The subject line was as dry as a policy manual. Consultation request. Security assessment. The body was just as bland, but the subtext was clear. Something was wrong again. Something only I could fix. I almost ignored it. We had a dozen contracts in motion at Ellison Secure, and my time was worth more now, not just in money, but in principle. But I read it again, and there it was. Per COO Fraser's recommendation. Her name, in black and white, like a match head waiting for the strike. For 2 days, I let the email sit in my inbox. I walked past it like a door I wasn't sure I wanted to open. The ocean outside my cottage kept rolling, indifferent to boardrooms and balance sheets. The watch on the windowsill kept fading. On the third morning, I replied. I kept it professional. Quoted our premium emergency ratio security 8. Triple my old consulting fee, plus an exclusivity clause that would bar me from working for any of their competitors for 60 days. I didn't expect them to accept all of it. They did within an hour. When I arrived at Veltrix, the lobby smelled the same. Polished stone, recycled air, and that faint chemical hint of lemon from the floor cleaner. But the security desk staff didn't recognize me. 12 years of walking past that counter, and now I was just another visitor with a badge that would expire by sunset. The elevator ride to the 27th floor was long enough for the old ghosts to stir. The memory of early mornings when the city was still dark, coffee in one hand and a dozen problems in the other. The memory of Helen's heels on the glass conference room floor, her perfume blooming in the air before she spoke. The doors opened, and there she was. Helen Fraser hadn't changed much. The same perfect posture, the same tailored suit in a color that dared you to underestimate her. But there was a thinness around her eyes now, a tightness in her smile that wasn't there before. "Marcus," she said, her voice bright but brittle. "Good of you to come." I just nodded. "Where's the issue?" She led me down the hall, talking fast, skipping over the pleasantries she used to weaponize. The network had been hit with a sophisticated intrusion attempt, inside knowledge, deliberate targeting. They'd contained it, but the board wanted an external audit, for optics. The server room was the same hum and chill it had always been, but standing there now, I felt none of the old ownership. This was no longer my fortress. It was just a contract. As I worked, I noticed little changes, firmware patched clumsily, architecture decisions that traded resilience for cost savings, choices Helen had signed off on. It wasn't sabotage, but it was neglect, the kind that hollowed out systems from the inside. We finished the technical review in under 2 hours. The vulnerability wasn't catastrophic, but it was embarrassing. An outdated authentication protocol left, active on a critical subsystem, sloppy and entirely avoidable. When I closed my laptop, Helen was watching me. "Well?" she asked. I leaned back in the chair, taking my time. "You'll be fine this time, but if you keep cutting corners, someone's going to walk right through your gates." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "You always did enjoy the dramatics." "No," I said quietly. I just know what happens when people forget who built the gates in the first place. The board debrief was the real reason I came. Not because they'd asked, but because I wanted them to see me. To see what I'd become without them. The conference room hadn't changed. The city stretched out behind glass that made everything look cleaner than it was. Helen sat at the head of the table. The board members were already there, folders in front of them, the air heavy with that particular scent of expensive cologne and old money. I gave my report in plain language, with none of the jargon that had once been my shield. I told them the truth. The breach had been possible because of efficiency measures that compromised system integrity, that the architecture they'd inherited from my tenure had been chipped away until it was only a shell. Helen shifted in her seat. We've been adapting to changing market demands. Cutting, I said, my voice steady. Not adapting. There's a difference. One of the directors, a man with silver hair and the kind of suit that cost more than my first car, leaned forward. And what would you recommend, Mr. Ellison? I let the pause stretch just long enough. Build a fortress, or keep patching the walls and hope the enemy is lazy. Silence followed. Not the awkward kind, the kind that tells you the words have landed. They paid my invoice before I left the building. In the elevator, I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall. The same face, but not the same and who'd ridden this lift down 12 years ago with a cardboard box of personal items, and Helen's voice still in his ear telling him it was just business. This time, I was leaving with nothing in my hands and everything I needed. A month later, the industry news broke. Helen Fraser had resigned from Veltrix, citing personal reasons. The article buried the truth in corporate euphemism, but I knew what it meant. The breach, the board meeting, the erosion of trust. It had all caught up with her. I didn't celebrate. Not in the way people imagine. There was no champagne, no smug toast, just a quiet evening on the porch, the ocean wind in my face, the watch still fading on the windowsill. Because the real victory wasn't Helen's fall, it was the fact that her name no longer carried weight in my life. She wasn't a shadow I worked under, or a storm I braced for. She was just a chapter, closed and shelved. Ellison Secure kept growing. We moved into a bigger loft, hired more people, turned down contracts from companies that smelled like Veltrix. One night, locking up the office, I caught my reflection in the glass door, tired from the day's work but steady. Behind me the hum of servers filled the room, a sound that once meant sleepless vigilance, now meaning stability. I thought about that first day after she fired me, the rain on the conference room glass, the sour taste of betrayal in my mouth, and I thought about now, the air clear, the glass clean, the horizon open. In the end, I realized the truth wasn't that success is the best revenge. It's that revenge stops mattering when you've truly succeeded.